4 years, fans have heard Jelly Roll tell his redemption story. The jail cells, the illegal substances, the music that saved him. He has told it on podcasts, at the Grammys, in front of the United States Senate. But there is one version of that story that nobody had heard until last year. Then his daughter sat down on a podcast and told it herself. What 16-year-old Bailee and revealed wasn't what anyone expected. And it changes everything you thought you knew about that family. On May 22, 2008, a prison guard walked up to a cell inside the Davidson County Jail in Nashville and knocked on the door. Inside was a 23-year-old inmate named Jason Bradley DeFord, serving time on a felony possession with intent to distribute charge. He had been in and out of correctional facilities since he was a teenager. By his own count given on radio interviews years later, he had been arrested more than 40 times by the age of 25. The guard told him his daughter had just been born. Jelly Roll has told this story across nearly every major outlet he has appeared on since his rise to country music fame. In his Billboard cover story from June of 2023, he described it as the first moment in his life that he felt an urgent pull to become someone different. On Jimmy Kimmel Live in June of 2024, he compared it to the Damascus Road moment from the Bible, the moment Saul turned to Paul. He said it was the first time he had cried in years. On Sunday Today with Willie Geist that October, he described looking around the jail cell with $17 worth of honey buns and potato chips to his name and realizing he was now responsible for a child. The daughter was Bailee Ann DeFord, born to a woman named Felicia A. Beckwith. Jelly Roll had been in a relationship with Felicia in the years before his most recent incarceration. By the time Bailee was born, the relationship was already strained, and the legal situation that would follow over the next decade would prove more complicated than the inspirational version of the story usually suggests. When Jelly Roll was released around the time of Bailee's second birthday in 2010, he met her in person for the first time. He has said in multiple interviews that the visits were limited at first because Felicia controlled access. On the Smartless podcast in March of 2025, Jelly Roll described going to court every 6 months for years, fighting to gain expanded visitation, then partial custody, then full custody. He told the hosts he just kept showing up and proving he was changing. Music, he said, wasn't even part of the picture yet. He just wanted to be a good dad. But the custody fight took longer than anyone outside that family understood. And the conditions Bailee was living in during those were far worse than the public ever knew at the time. Felicia Beckwith was, by all accounts, present in Bailee's early life. Bailee lived with Felicia and her maternal grandparents for the first several years. Then, in 2015, Felicia was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. The diagnosis came with prescription pain medication. That medication, according to Jelly Roll's own statements in the Hulu documentary Save Me, which premiered at the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville on May 30, 2023, became the beginning of an addiction spiral that would consume the next decade of their lives. Jelly Roll said in the documentary that he could see what was happening before anyone wanted to admit it. He described watching her pill dependency escalate, then watching it transition into something far worse. By the time Felicia was in full addiction, the household Bailee was growing up in had collapsed. But the most detailed account of those years did not come from Jelly Roll. It came from Bailee herself, sitting across from her stepmother Bunny XO on the Dumb Blonde podcast in February of 2024. The episode is titled Bailee and Strength and Healing. It was released on February 21st. The full transcript is publicly available online. In her own words, Bailee said the decline began when she was in kindergarten. By first grade, she said, things were essentially gone. She described the condition of the house she lived in during those years as horrendous, said it still gave her nightmares as a teenager, and made clear that her memories of that period were not vague impressions but specific scenes she carried with her. Bailee was a young child being raised inside an active addiction. Her father, meanwhile, was building a music career out of the back of a van and slowly, court date by court date, working his way toward being able to take her home. The custody picture finally changed in 2016. That year, Jelly Roll met a Las Vegas podcaster named Elisa, known publicly as Bunny XO, at a small venue called the Las Vegas Country Saloon. Their relationship moved quickly. They eloped at a Las Vegas courthouse in late August of 2016. Almost immediately, the two of them began pushing for full custody of Bailee. The legal process was completed in 2017. On the Smartless podcast in March of 2025, Jelly Roll confirmed the year directly. He said he and his wife had had full custody of his daughter for 8 years, which lines up exactly with a 2017 handover. He also said, plainly, that he could not have gotten that custody without Bunny XO. In his Billboard interview, he had said the same thing in slightly different words, calling her the woman who came in and took on a child that was about to be hers in everything but biology, and admitting that he would never have had the stability or the money to win that case alone. On the Bus Sin with the Boys podcast in June of 2024, Jelly Roll went further. He said outright that Bunny XO had personally paid for the legal fees during the custody fight in the early years before he had any meaningful music income. The woman who would later become a podcast host and a public figure in her own right had bankrolled the case that brought Bailee home. Bunny XO has also talked openly about her own role in the family. She has consistently described herself as a bonus mom rather than an adoptive one, even though she is the only mother figure Bailee has lived with full-time since she was 8. Bunny has said in multiple posts and interviews that Bailee calls her mom by choice, not by request. There is one other detail from the People magazine cover story in November of 2024 that puts the whole custody arrangement in perspective. Jelly Roll told the reporter that Bailee had been in the same public school district for 10 years. The same friends, the same teachers, the same routines. While he was building one of the most chaotic careers in the music industry, he and Bunny XO had deliberately kept Bailee's life as ordinary as possible. She didn't switch to private school when the money came in. She didn't change districts when he got famous. The stability was treated as the priority. So what was Bailee living through while all of this was being negotiated? And what did she eventually do with the music she found inside that chaos? In 2020, when Bailee was 10 years old, she sat down with her father and told him she wanted to write a song. She has since said in podcast interviews that she viewed songwriting as a form of therapy. The song they wrote together was called Tears Could Talk. It was released that year on Jelly Roll's album A Beautiful Disaster, credited as a featured collaboration with his daughter. The song was about Felicia. Jelly Roll has been careful in public interviews to let Bailee speak for herself about that song when she chooses to. But he has discussed the writing process on multiple occasions. He has said in his Sunday Today interview and elsewhere that he was struck by how clearly she understood what she was processing at age 10, and how much of it she was able to put into her own lyrics rather than borrow his. 3 years later, on July 11 of 2023, Jelly Roll was performing the Backroad Baptism Tour in Alpharetta, Georgia. Mid-show, he told the audience that his 15-year-old daughter was with him on the road that night. He explained in his own way that she had written a song years earlier about therapy through music, and that he wanted the crowd to meet her. Bailee walked out on stage and performed Tears Could Talk in front of a stadium audience. It was the most public moment in their relationship at that point. It was also, by every account from people in the audience and from later interviews, entirely her decision. She wasn't being pushed into the spotlight. She was choosing it. That summer would turn out to be the calm before the storm. Because by the time Bailee was performing on stage with her father in Georgia, the events of the previous summer were still working their way through her in ways the public would not learn about until she finally talked about them herself. And what she had been hiding was much worse than anyone outside the family understood. The summer everything broke. In the summer of 2022, Bailee was 14 years old. Felicia, who had been periodically attempting recovery, was in what Bailee later described as a sober period, and Bailee chose to spend a portion of the summer with her. The relapse happened during that summer. On the February 2024 Dumb Blonde podcast, Bailee laid out the specifics herself. She described her mother introducing her to marijuana, then alcohol, then illegal substances. She described other substances coming into the picture in ways no 14-year-old should ever encounter from a parent. The mother who was supposed to be in recovery had brought her own daughter into the relapse. The breaking point, Bailee said in her own words on that podcast, was the 4th of July of that year. She got into the car with Felicia. Her mother told her, in the casual way that turned the whole moment into a horror story for Bailee, that they were stopping by her dealer first. Bailee, sitting in the passenger seat at 14 years old, realized in that moment that everything she had been hoping about her mother's recovery was over. She came home to her father and Bunny XO at the end of the summer in crisis. What Bailee did not tell anyone outside the family at that time, but did eventually disclose on the podcast, was that she was carrying years of compounding mental health struggles underneath the surface. She had been quietly struggling for far longer than anyone realized. Her parents stepped in. What they did next was not a casual decision. Jelly Roll and Bunny XO made the call to enroll Bailee in a residential wilderness therapy program designed for adolescents in crisis. The program lasted approximately 8 weeks. Bailee herself stayed nearly 9 weeks, voluntarily extending her own time after her parents came to visit her. She has talked about that extension as her own decision. She wasn't being kept there. She chose more time. When she came home, she did something that took most people in her position decades to do. She made the call to cut Felicia out of her life entirely. But would the daughter who had survived all of that be willing to tell the world what she had lived through? And what made her decide to finally do it on her stepmother's podcast in early 2024? Strength and Healing. The February 21st, 2024 episode of Dumb Blonde is, to date, the single most detailed public statement Bailee has ever made about her own life. The episode title is Bailee and Strength and Healing. Bunny XO is the host. The two of them sat down together and went through it. Bailee spoke for the entire episode without flinching. She walked through the timeline of Felicia's addiction. She talked about the house she grew up in. She talked about her grandmother trying to keep things together. She talked about Felicia's periods of incarceration and the reconnection in 6th grade when her mother was in sober living. She talked about the summer of 2022 and the 4th of July moment. She talked about the wilderness program. She talked about her own depression, her own anger, her own self-medication during that period. And then she said something that landed harder than anything else in the episode. She said that her mother, in her view, was without a soul. She did not say it with anger. She said it with the kind of clarity that comes from a teenager who has thought about it for years and arrived at a conclusion she is no longer willing to soften. For a 15-year-old to articulate what Bailee articulated on that podcast, in that level of detail, on her own terms, with her stepmother across from her, is something that even seasoned interviewers have called remarkable. It was not packaged. It was not rehearsed. It was a young person who had survived something she did not deserve and who had decided, for her own reasons, that she was ready to talk about it.